Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The village where no bells rang. The village of Stillwater sat in a valley so deep that dawn arrived 2 hours late and dusk came early, stealing the afternoon before the farmers could finish their work. It was a place of mist and moss where the river ran dark as old iron, and the hills pressed close on all sides like the walls of a forgotten room. The houses were built of grey stone, their roofs thick with lichen, and the narrow streets wound between them like the paths of some ancient maze that had long since lost its centre. For 300 years, the people of Stillwater had lived without bells. No church tower rose above the houses, no clock chimed the hours, no handbell summoned children to lessons or called the faithful to prayer. The silence was so complete, so fundamental to the nature of the place, that visitors often remarked they could hear their own hearts beating as they walked through the village square. The silence had begun in 1723, in the winter of the Great Frost, when the river froze solid for the first time in living memory. Before that winter, Stillwater had possessed a church with a bell tower that could be seen from every corner of the valley, and bells that rang 7 times each day, at dawn, at mid-morning, at noon, at mid-afternoon, at evening, at dusk, and at the last hour before true darkness fell. The bells had rung for christenings and marriages and funerals. They had rung to warn of fire and flood. They had rung on feast days and holy days, and their sound had been as much a part of Stillwater as the river itself. But in 1723, the bells fell silent, and they never rang again. The man who had rung the bells was named Thomas Garrett, and he was the sexton of St. Columba's Church, a position his family had held for 7 generations. Thomas was 42 years old that winter, a tall man with shoulders bent from years of pulling bell ropes, with hands calloused and strong, and eyes the colour of smoke. He had a wife named Catherine, and 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and he lived in the sexton's house that stood in the shadow of the church tower, so close that when the bells rang, the whole house trembled with their voice. Thomas loved the bells as other men loved their children or their land. He knew each bell by its tone and temperament. The great tenor bell, cast in 1687, had a voice like thunder rolling across summer fields. The second bell sang clear and bright as morning. The third had a minor tone that spoke of sorrow and remembrance. The fourth was smallest and highest, with a voice like silver coins falling on marble. Together they made a music that Thomas believed held the village together, that marked the passage of time and gave shape to the days. On the morning of the 23rd of December in 1723, Thomas climbed the tower stairs as he had done every morning for 24 years. The frost had come in the night, and the stones were cold enough to burn his hands as he steadied himself on the spiral staircase. When he reached the bell chamber, he found ice coating the walls, thick as window glass, and his breath hung in the air like smoke. He took hold of the rope for the dawn bell and pulled. The bell swung, but instead of ringing, it gave a sound like breaking. A crack sharp and terrible that echoed through the tower and out across the frozen valley. Thomas felt the rope go slack in his hands. When he looked up, he saw that the great tenor bell had split from crown to sound bow, a fracture that ran through the bronze like a lightning strike frozen in metal. He stood in the silence that followed, his hands still holding the useless rope, and felt something break inside himself that was harder to name than bronze or stone. The village council met that afternoon in the house of Edmund Ashworth, who was the oldest man in Stillwater and had served as magistrate for 30 years. Besides Edmund, there were 5 other council members. Margaret Thorne, who kept the largest inn and knew everyone's business. Robert Sinclair, who owned most of the farmland in the valley. James Worth, the blacksmith. Anne Carlyle, who had taught in the village school for 40 years. And Father Benedict, the priest of St. Columba's. Thomas Garrett stood before them and told what had happened. His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he spoke. "The bell has cracked," he said. "The frost was too much for it. The metal was old, 136 years old. It split clean through." "Can it be repaired?" Edmund Ashworth asked. He was 83 years old, thin as a willow branch, but his mind was still sharp as winter stars. "No," Thomas said, "not repaired. It would need to be recast entirely." "Then we'll have it recast," Robert Sinclair said. He was a practical man, used to solving problems with money and labor. "How much would it cost?" Thomas had already made the calculations. He had spent the morning in the tower, measuring the broken bell, estimating its weight and the cost of bronze. £300, he said, perhaps more, and 6 months at least for the casting and the transport from the foundry in Newcastle. The council members looked at each other. £300 was more money than the village collected in taxes in 2 years. It was more money than most of them had seen in their entire lives. "We don't have £300, Margaret Thorne said flatly. "We barely have 30. "We could raise it," Anne Carlyle suggested. "Each family could contribute what they can." "In the middle of winter?" James Worth shook his head. "Half the families in Stillwater are struggling to feed themselves until spring. You can't ask them to pay for a bell when they need bread." They argued for 2 hours, proposing and rejecting solutions. They could borrow money from the diocese, but that would take months and might be refused. They could sell some of the church's silver candlesticks, but those were worth perhaps £20 together. They could wait until spring and plant an extra crop to sell, but that would mean no bell for a full year. And what if the other bells cracked in the meantime? Finally, Father Benedict spoke. He was a small man, barely 60 years old, but already white-haired, with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we should consider whether we need the bells at all." The room fell silent. Thomas Garrett felt his heart stop in his chest. "What do you mean?" Edmund Ashworth asked. "I mean," Father Benedict said, "that we have lived with bells for 300 years, but humans lived without them for thousands of years before that. The bells are beautiful, and I love them as much as anyone. But they are not necessary for prayer or for work or for life itself. If we cannot afford to replace them, perhaps God is telling us to learn a different way of living." "That's blasphemy," Thomas said, and his voice came out harder than he intended. Father Benedict looked at him with something like pity. "It's not blasphemy to accept poverty, Thomas. It's merely practical." "The bells are part of who we are," Thomas said. Without them, what are we? We're still ourselves, Anne Carlyle said gently. We're still water. But Thomas shook his head. No, we won't be. You don't understand. The bells are what make time real. Without them, how will we know when to wake, when to work, when to pray? How will we mark the important moments? How will we call people together? We'll find other ways, Robert Sinclair said. We'll use sundials and sand clocks. We'll send messengers when we need to gather people. We'll adapt. And what about when someone dies? Thomas asked. What about when a child is born? What about marriages and feast days? Will you tell me those moments matter less because we can't afford to ring bells for them? Of course not, Margaret Thorne said. But Thomas, £300. I'll find the money, Thomas interrupted. Give me until spring. I'll find a way to raise it. Edmund Ashworth sighed. Thomas, we appreciate your dedication, but... Until spring, Thomas repeated. That's all I ask. 3 months. If I can't raise the money by then, we'll accept that the bells are gone. But give me the chance to try. The council members looked at each other. Finally, Edmund nodded. Very well, 3 months. But, Thomas, don't destroy yourself over this. Some things, once broken, are meant to stay broken. Thomas didn't answer. He left the meeting and walked through the frozen streets back to his house. Catherine was waiting for him by the fire, and she knew from his face what had been decided. How much do we need? She asked. £300. She closed her eyes. Their entire savings amounted to perhaps £8. Thomas, that's impossible. I know. Then why did you promise to try? He looked at her, and she saw in his face something desperate and lost. Because without the bells, he said, I don't know who I am. Thomas Garrett spent the next 3 months trying to save the bells. He wrote letters to every wealthy family within 50 miles, begging for contributions. He travelled to Newcastle and spoke with the bishop, pleading for a loan from the diocese. He went door to door in Stillwater, asking every family if they could spare even a few shillings, though he knew they had nothing to give. He sold everything he owned that had value. The silver pocket watch his father had given him brought £3. Catherine's mother's jewellery brought 4 more. They sold furniture, books, Catherine's winter coat, the good dishes they had received as wedding gifts. They ate nothing but porridge and bread. They burned less coal, and the house grew cold. The children learned to sleep in their clothes. By the end of February, Thomas had raised £57 and 10 shillings. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. But he couldn't stop trying. In early March, a letter arrived from a family named Whitmore, who lived in a manor house 15 miles north of Stillwater. They had heard about the broken bell, the letter said, and they wanted to help. They proposed a solution. They would pay for the bell to be recast, all £300, in exchange for one small condition. They wanted the bell, once cast, to be dedicated to their family name. A plaque would be mounted in the bell tower, and the bell would be rung in a special pattern on the anniversary of old Lord Whitmore's death each year. Thomas brought the letter to Father Benedict and the village council. They met again in Edmund Ashworth's house, and this time the mood was different. 3 months had passed, and the silence of the village had become normal. People had adapted, just as Robert Sinclair had predicted. They woke with the sun and went to bed when darkness fell. They marked time by the position of shadows, and the rhythm of their work. Some had even begun to say they preferred the quiet. "It's a generous offer," Edmund Ashworth said, reading the letter. "The Whitmores are being very kind." "Kind?" Thomas repeated. "They want to buy our bell. They want to put their name on it like it's a gravestone." "They want to help us," Margaret Thorne corrected. "And they're asking very little in return. 1 day of special ringing per year? That's nothing." "It's everything," Thomas said. "The bells belong to Stillwater, to all of us. They shouldn't carry any single family's name." "Thomas," Anne Carlyle said gently, "the bell is broken. It belongs to no one right now, and without the Whitmores' money, it will stay broken. Then we find another way." "There is no other way," Robert Sinclair said, and his voice was tired. "We've tried for 3 months. You've tried harder than anyone could expect, but the money doesn't exist. Either we accept the Whitmores' offer, or we accept that the bells are gone forever." Thomas looked at Father Benedict. "You would allow this? You would let them buy our church?" "They're not buying the church," Father Benedict said. "They're buying a plaque and 1 day of remembrance per year. That's not unreasonable, Thomas." "What about 2 years from now when another bell breaks? What about 5 years from now? Will we sell a different piece of ourselves each time till there's nothing left that's actually ours?" "That's not fair," Edmund said. "We're doing what we must to survive." "No," Thomas said. "You're doing what's easy, and there's a difference." He stood up and walked out of the meeting. He didn't wait for their decision, because he already knew what it would be. They would accept the Whitmores' offer. The bell would be recast, the plaque would be mounted, and Stillwater would have its bells back, but they would belong to someone else. Thomas walked home through streets that felt different now, in ways he couldn't quite name. He thought about the 3 months he had spent begging for money, the things he had sold, the pride he had swallowed. He thought about Catherine's face when he had asked her to give up her mother's jewellery, about his children eating porridge for breakfast and porridge for dinner, and nothing in between. He had done all of that to save something that no one else seemed to think was worth saving. When he reached his house, Catherine was waiting. She took one look at him and knew. "What will you do?" she asked. Thomas sat by the fire and stared into the flames. "I don't know," he said. But that was a lie. He already knew. 3 days later, in the hour before dawn, Thomas Garrett climbed the stairs of the bell tower one final time. He carried with him a length of rope and a knife. The tower was dark and cold, and his footsteps echoed on the stone stairs. When he reached the bell chamber, he stood for a long time looking at the 4 bells hanging in their ancient frame. The great tenor bell was still split, its fracture black and sharp in the dim light. The other 3 bells hung silent, waiting for a purpose that might never come. Thomas had spent half his life in this room. He had pulled these ropes in sunlight and storm, in joy and grief, on ordinary mornings and extraordinary nights. He had rung the bells for the birth of his children and the death of his parents. He had rung them for wars and for peace, for fear and for celebration. The bells had given shape to his life, and now that shape was breaking apart. He tied one end of the rope to the bell frame and made a noose with the other end. He tested the knot carefully, because even in this final act, he wanted to do the work properly. But when he put the noose around his neck, something stopped him. Not fear. He had moved beyond fear. Not doubt. He was certain of what he wanted. What stopped him was a sound. It was the sound of the river. In the perfect silence of the tower, in the hour before dawn when the village slept and no wind stirred, Thomas could hear the river running far below. He had never noticed it before, not in all his years of ringing bells. The bells had always been too loud, their voice drowning out everything else. But now, in the silence they had left behind, he could hear the river's voice, deep and constant, flowing through the darkness like a secret the valley had kept for thousands of years. Thomas stood with the rope around his neck and listened to the river. He listened for a long time, and slowly something shifted inside him, something he couldn't name but could feel like ice cracking in spring. He took off the noose. He untied the rope from the bell frame. He sat down on the floor of the bell chamber and wept. When dawn came, Thomas climbed down from the tower and walked to Edmund Ashworth's house. He told the council that he would not oppose the Whitmores' offer. He would not fight any more. He was done. Edmund looked at him with concern. "Are you well, Thomas?" "No," Thomas said, "but I will be." The Whitmores' money arrived in April, and by May the broken bell had been transported to Newcastle for recasting. The process took 4 months, just as Thomas had predicted. In September of 1724, the new bell returned to Stillwater. It was beautiful. Everyone agreed on that. The founders had done excellent work. The bell's voice was strong and clear, perhaps even more beautiful than the old bell had been. The dedication plaque was modest, just a small brass plate mounted on the tower wall, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. On the first Sunday after the bell's return, Father Benedict announced that Thomas Garrett would ring the bells again, that the silence was over, that Stillwater would return to the way things had been. But when Sunday came, Thomas was not in the tower. He was in his house, sitting by the window, listening to the silence. Catherine found him there. "Thomas," she said gently, "they're waiting for you." "I know. Will you go?" "No." "Why not?" He looked at her, and she saw in his face something new. Not the desperation she had seen 3 months ago, but a strange kind of peace. "Because," he said, "I finally understand what Father Benedict meant. We don't need the bells. We never did. We only thought we needed them because we'd forgotten how to hear anything else." "But you love the bells." "I loved what I thought they were," Thomas corrected. "I thought they were what gave meaning to time, what made moments matter. But I was wrong. The moments matter whether we mark them or not. Time moves whether we measure it or not. The bells were beautiful, but they were also loud enough to drown out everything else." "What will you do?" Catherine asked. "I don't know yet," Thomas said, "but I know I won't go back to that tower." On that Sunday, Robert Sinclair's eldest son, a young man named William, who had just turned 18, climbed the tower stairs and rang the bells for the first time. He had never done it before, and his rhythm was uncertain, his timing imperfect. But the bells rang, and the village heard them, and some people smiled with relief, and others frowned with annoyance at the noise they had learned to live without. Thomas Garrett sat in his house and listened to the bells ring, and he felt nothing. The sound that had once been his whole life now seemed distant and small, like something remembered from childhood that had lost its power to move him. After that Sunday, the bells rang sporadically. William Sinclair had no love for the work, and after 3 weeks, he stopped climbing the tower altogether. Father Benedict tried ringing the bells himself a few times, but he was an old man, and the work exhausted him. Other villagers volunteered, but none kept at it for more than a few days. By October, the bells had fallen silent again. This time, no one called a council meeting to discuss what should be done. The silence had become natural, and the bells had become an ornament, beautiful but unnecessary, like a painting of a place no one planned to visit. Thomas Garrett found new work. He helped Robert Sinclair with the autumn harvest, and discovered he liked the rhythm of physical labor, the simplicity of moving through fields with the sun on his back and the sound of wind in the grain. He helped James Worth in the blacksmith's forge, learning to shape metal with heat and hammer. He spent time with his children, teaching them things he had never had time to teach before. And every morning, in the hour before dawn, he walked down to the river and sat on the bank and listened to the water move in the darkness. Catherine watched him change. The desperation left his face. The tension left his shoulders. He became quieter, but also more present, more attentive to the small details of daily life. He noticed things he had never noticed before. The patterns of frost on windows, the way evening light turned the hills gold, the sound of his children laughing in the next room. One evening in November, nearly a year after the great bell had cracked, Catherine asked him if he missed ringing the bells. "Sometimes," he said, "but not as much as I thought I would." "Do you regret what happened?" Thomas thought about that for a long time. "No," he finally said. "I regret some of the things I did trying to save them. I regret making you sell your mother's jewelry. I regret putting you and the children through those hungry months, but I don't regret that the bells stopped ringing. I think maybe they needed to stop so I could hear other things." "Like what?" "Like the river," he said. "Like the wind. Like you breathing beside me at night. Like my own thoughts, which I never had time to listen to before, because there was always a bell that needed ringing." The winter of 1724 came and went. The bells remained silent, and Stillwater adapted. People developed new rhythms for their days, new ways of marking time. The farmers woke with the sun and worked until their bodies told them to rest. The shopkeepers opened when customers came and closed when darkness fell. Children learned to measure time by their hunger and their tiredness instead of by bells. Some of the older villagers grumbled about the change. Edmund Ashworth complained that without bells to mark the hours, he never knew if he was late or early for anything. Margaret Thorne said the silence made the inn feel empty, even when it was full. But most people, especially the younger ones, didn't miss the bells at all. They had never known why bells were necessary in the first place, and the silence suited them fine. The Whitmores, who had paid £300 for the new bell, came to Stillwater in December to visit their investment. Lord Whitmore was a heavy man in his 50s with expensive clothes and an air of perpetual dissatisfaction. When he saw that the bells weren't being rung, he was furious. "We paid for that bell," he shouted at Father Benedict in the church vestry. "We paid £300 so you could have your bells back, and you're not even using them." "No one wanted to ring them," Father Benedict said calmly. "We tried to find someone, but the work is hard, and the enthusiasm wasn't there." "Then make someone do it. You have a sexton, don't you? Make him ring the bells. That's his job." Thomas Garrett has resigned his position, Father Benedict said. He no longer wishes to ring bells. Then hire someone else? With what money? We barely have enough to heat the church in winter. Lord Whitmore's face turned red. This is unacceptable. We had an agreement. The bells were to be rung, and they were to be rung especially on the anniversary of my father's death. That's in 3 weeks. If those bells are not rung, I will take legal action. I will take back my money, and I will take the bell itself as compensation for breach of contract. Father Benedict looked at the angry man before him and felt very tired. Do what you must, Lord Whitmore. I won't stop you. Whitmore left Stillwater that afternoon, and 3 weeks later, on the anniversary of his father's death, no bells rang. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived from Whitmore's solicitor, demanding the return of the £300, plus an additional £100 in damages, or else the removal of the bell itself as collateral. The village council met again, this time in a mood of weary resignation. They had no money to return. They had known when they accepted Whitmore's offer that there was risk involved, but they had believed, or wanted to believe, that things would work out somehow. We'll have to let him take the bell, Edmund Ashworth said. We have no choice. Let him take all of them, Margaret Thorne said. What's the point of keeping bells no one wants to ring? Thomas started this, Robert Sinclair said, and there was anger in his voice. He convinced us we needed new bells. We went into debt for them, and then he abandoned us. Maybe he should be the one to pay the price. Robert, Anne Carlyle said quietly, that's not fair. Thomas never asked us to accept Whitmore's money. We made that decision ourselves. After he made it impossible to refuse, after he spent 3 months telling us how important the bells were, how we couldn't live without them. He was wrong, Father Benedict interrupted. He was wrong about many things, but he was also in pain, and we should have seen that. We should have helped him, instead of arguing with him. The council fell silent. After a while, Edmund Ashworth said, What do we tell Whitmore? Tell him the truth, Father Benedict said. Tell him he can have his bell back. Tell him we're sorry for the trouble, and then let's be done with this whole mess. But before they could send their reply to Whitmore, something unexpected happened. On a cold morning in January of 1725, a stranger came to Stillwater. He was a young man, perhaps 25 years old, dressed in the rough clothes of a travelling labourer. He had dark hair and darker eyes, and he carried a worn leather satchel over one shoulder. He walked directly to St. Columba's Church and asked Father Benedict if he could see the bells. They're not being used, Father Benedict warned, and they may not be here much longer. I know, the stranger said. That's why I came. Father Benedict led him up the tower stairs. When they reached the bell chamber, the stranger set down his satchel and walked around the bells, examining them carefully. He touched the bronze with gentle hands, traced the decorative patterns cast into the metal, tested the wheels and bearings that held the bells in place. They're beautiful, he said, well maintained. The sexton who cared for these knew what he was doing. He did, Father Benedict agreed, but he doesn't work here anymore. The stranger nodded, still looking at the bells. I heard about what happened, about the crack and the new casting, and the man who tried to save them. That's why I came. Who are you? My name is David Thorne, the stranger said. I'm a bell ringer. I I travel from place to place, finding bells that aren't being rung and bringing them back to life. I heard about Stillwater and I wanted to see if I could help." "We can't pay you," Father Benedict said. "We barely have money for bread." "I don't want money," David said. "I want to ring the bells." Father Benedict studied the young man's face. "Why?" "Because bells aren't meant to be silent," David said. "Because every bell has a voice that deserves to be heard. Because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because I believe silence can be a kind of forgetting, and I don't think people should forget beautiful things just because they're difficult." "Thomas Garrett would have liked you," Father Benedict said softly. "You sound like he used to sound before everything broke." "Is he still in the village?" "Yes, but I don't think he wants to talk about bells." "That's all right," David said. "I don't need to talk to him. I just need permission to ring." Father Benedict considered. "The village council would have to approve. And even if they do, I should warn you, many people here have come to prefer the silence. They may not want the bells ringing again." "Then I'll ring them quietly," David said with a slight smile. "Well, as quietly as bells can be rung." The council met that evening and heard David Thorne's proposal. He wanted nothing. No money, no housing, no food. He had his own savings from previous work, he said, and he could sleep in the church if need be. He only wanted to ring the bells. "Why would anyone do that for free?" Robert Sinclair asked suspiciously. "Some people have vocations," Anne Carlyle said. "Callings. Maybe this is his." "Or maybe he's mad," Margaret Thorne suggested. "Maybe," Edmund Ashworth said, "but he's harmless mad, if so, and if he wants to ring the bells, I see no reason to stop him. It might even solve our problem with Lord Whitmore." "Will it, though?" Robert Sinclair asked. "Whitmore wanted the bells rung on a specific day, in a specific pattern. Will this young man do that?" "I can ask him," Father Benedict said. When asked, David Thorne agreed without hesitation. He would ring the bells whenever the village wanted, in whatever pattern they specified. He would ring for Lord Whitmore's dead father. He would ring for weddings and funerals. He would ring the hours, if they wanted, or he would ring only dawn and dusk, or he would ring just once a week on Sunday mornings. Whatever they wanted, he would do. The council, suspicious of such easy agreement, nonetheless granted permission. There was nothing to lose, after all. If David Thorne wanted to spend his days pulling bell ropes, that was his choice. David began ringing the bells the next morning. He rang them at dawn, 3 strong strokes on each bell in turn, and the sound rolled across the valley like it had in the old days. People stopped in the streets and looked up at the tower with expressions of surprise and nostalgia and annoyance in equal measure. Thomas Garrett was in his house when he heard the bells. I was drinking morning tea with Catherine, and when the sound came through the window, he felt something twist in his chest. Not quite pain, but close to it. "Someone's ringing the bells," Catherine said unnecessarily. Thomas didn't answer. He finished his tea and stood up and walked outside. Several neighbours were standing in the street, looking toward the church. "Who is it?" someone asked. "A stranger?" someone else answered. "A young man. He came yesterday and asked if he could ring them." Thomas walked to the church. He didn't want to. Some part of him wanted to stay far away, to not see whoever had taken his place in the tower. But another part of him needed to know who had touched his bells. He found David Thorne in the bell chamber, coiling the ropes after the morning ringing. The young man looked up when Thomas entered and smiled. "You must be Thomas Garrett," David said. "I hoped I'd meet you." "How did you know who I am?" "People in the village told me. They said you were the sexton here for 24 years. They said you loved the bells more than anything." Thomas felt his face harden. "I was the sexton. I'm not any more." "I know. Father Benedict told me what happened. I'm sorry about the crack and about everything that came after. That must have been very hard." "It was," Thomas said shortly. "But it's over now." David nodded. He finished coiling the ropes and hung them neatly on their hooks. His movements were efficient and practiced. "You maintained these bells very well," he said. "The wheels turn smoothly. The clappers are properly weighted. You clearly knew what you were doing." "I did my job." "It was more than a job, though, wasn't it?" David said gently. "You loved them." Thomas felt anger rise in him, sharp and sudden and unfair. "What do you want?" he asked. "Why are you here?" "I'm here to ring the bells." "Why? No one asked you to come? No one needs you here?" "Maybe not," David said, "but the bells need someone, and I need bells to ring, so it works out." "You're mad," Thomas said, echoing Margaret Thorne's earlier assessment. David smiled. "Maybe, or maybe I just understand something you've forgotten." "And what's that?" "That bells aren't about need," David said. "They're about beauty. They're about marking moments, not because the moments need marking, but because beauty matters. Because the sound of bronze singing across a valley matters. Because some things are worth doing, even if they're not necessary." Thomas stared at the young man. "You sound like I used to sound," he said quietly, "before I learned better." "What did you learn?" "That beauty isn't enough, that it can't sustain you, that loving something beautiful will only break your heart." David considered that. "Maybe," he said, "but I think a broken heart that loves something beautiful is still better than an unbroken heart that loved nothing at all." Thomas turned and walked out of the bell chamber. He didn't want to hear any more. He didn't want to remember what it felt like to believe such things. But as he walked home through the morning streets, he found himself listening to the bells in a way he hadn't listened in months. David Thorne had good technique. The rhythm was clean. The intervals between strokes were even. The bells rang true. It was different from Thomas's own style, lighter somehow, but it was skilled work. And despite himself, despite everything, Thomas felt something stir inside him that might have been longing. David Thorne rang the bells every morning and every evening. He rang them on Sunday mornings for church services. He rang them on the anniversary of Lord Whitmore's father's death, exactly as specified in the agreement. He rang them for weddings and funerals when asked. He rang them on feast days and holy days. The village adjusted. Some people learned to love the sound again. Others continued to find it intrusive. Most simply accepted it as background noise, the way they accepted the sound of rain or wind or the river running through the valley. Lord Whitmore, when informed that the bells were being rung regularly again, was satisfied enough to drop his lawsuit. He never visited Stillwater again, but his annual payment for the anniversary ringing arrived each year without fail. Thomas Garrett watched all of this from a distance. He never went back to the bell chamber. He never spoke to David Thorne again after that first meeting, but he listened. Every morning and every evening, he stopped whatever he was doing and listened to the bells and felt that strange mixture of longing and relief, of loss and liberation. Catherine noticed. "You miss it," she said one evening as they sat by the fire listening to the evening bells. "No," Thomas said. "I don't miss it. I miss who I was when I did it. That's different." "Is it?" Thomas thought about that. "I don't know," he finally admitted. Winter gave way to spring. David Thorne continued his work in the bell tower. He was a quiet presence in the village, friendly but reserved, always polite but never quite connecting with anyone. He ate his meals alone. He walked alone. He lived in a small room Father Benedict had given him in the church building, and he spent his days reading or maintaining the bells or practicing different ringing patterns. "He's lonely," Catherine observed one day. "That young man ringing the bells? He has no friends here." "That's his choice," Thomas said. "Is it? Or is everyone avoiding him because they think you want them to?" Thomas looked at her. "Why would they think that?" "Because you're the one who gave up the bells, Thomas. You're the one who walked away. And people here respect that. They think that if you're avoiding David Thorne, they should too." "That's ridiculous." "Maybe," Catherine said, "but it's true nonetheless." Thomas thought about that conversation for several days. He noticed, now that Catherine had pointed it out, that David Thorne was indeed isolated. People were cordial to him, but distant. No one invited him to dinner. No one stopped to talk to him in the street. He was tolerated but not welcomed, accepted but not embraced. And Thomas realized that Catherine was right. It was his fault. His distance had created permission for everyone else's distance. On a morning in late March, Thomas walked to the church just after dawn. He climbed the tower stairs for the first time in more than a year. His legs remembered the pattern of the steps, the places where the stone was worn smooth by centuries of feet. He found David Thorne in the bell chamber, preparing for the morning ringing. The young man looked up in surprise. "Thomas," he said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Thomas admitted. "But I thought maybe I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For being cold to you, for making you unwelcome here. This is your bell chamber now, and I shouldn't have made you feel like you were trespassing." David shook his head. "You didn't make me feel that way. I understood. These were your bells for a long time. It must be strange to see someone else ringing them." "It is," Thomas said, "but that's not your fault, and I shouldn't punish you for it." They stood in silence for a moment. Then David said, "Would you like to ring them? Just once? I think they might like to hear your voice again." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I don't know if I can." "It's like anything else," David said. "You remember with your hands, even when your heart has forgotten." Thomas looked at the ropes hanging against the wall. The same ropes he had pulled 1,000 times before. Slowly, he walked to them. He took the rope for the second bell in his hands, feeling the familiar texture of the hemp, the weight of the bell hanging at the other end. He pulled. The bell swung and rang, and the sound filled the tower just as it always had. clear and bright as morning, exactly the same as he remembered. Thomas pulled again and again, finding the old rhythm returning to his muscles without conscious thought. He rang the full peal, 7 strokes, perfectly spaced, the sound rolling out across the valley where people would be waking, starting their day, listening without quite listening to a sound that had become part of the morning itself. When he finished, he let the rope go and stood with his hands shaking. "Thank you," he said to David Thorne. "For what?" "For reminding me," Thomas said, "that I can touch this and not be destroyed by it." From that day forward, Thomas visited the bell chamber regularly, not to ring. That was David's work now, and Thomas had no desire to take it back. But he came to help maintain the bells, to oil the wheels and clean the bearings, and check the ropes for wear. He taught David the subtle tricks he had learned over 24 years. How to coax the best sound from each bell, how to read the weather by the way the bells resonated, how to know when a bell was getting tired and needed rest. David proved to be a quick student and a grateful one. More than that, he proved to be good company. He was intelligent and well-read, curious about everything, and he had a quiet sense of humor that reminded Thomas of Father Benedict. They talked about bells, of course, but also about books and philosophy and the nature of beauty and meaning. They talked about why people need rituals and rhythms, why they mark time, why they build towers and hang bells in them and pull ropes to make them sing. "I think," David said one afternoon as they worked together, replacing a worn wheel bearing, "that bells are a way of making time visible, or rather, audible. Time is always moving, but we can't see it or feel it directly. So we ring bells to make it real, to give it shape and substance. Does that make sense?" "It does," Thomas said. "I used to believe that too. I used to think the bells were what made time real." "You don't believe that anymore?" "No," Thomas said. "Now, I think time is real whether we mark it or not. The bells don't make time visible. They just make us pay attention to it." "Isn't that the same thing?" "Maybe," Thomas said. "Or maybe the difference is that one way requires bells and the other doesn't." David smiled. "You've become very philosophical in your retirement." "I've had time to think," Thomas said. "That's something I never had before, when I was ringing bells 7 times a day." Over the following months, Thomas and David became friends. Catherine was pleased to see the change in her husband. The bitterness that had haunted him after the great bell cracked had faded, replaced by something calmer and more settled. He seemed comfortable with his life in a way he never had before. "You're happier now than you were a sexton," Catherine observed one evening. Thomas considered that. "I don't know if I'm happier," he said, "but I'm more at peace, and maybe that's better than happiness." In the summer of 1726, Father Benedict became ill. It was nothing sudden or dramatic, just the slow failing that comes to old men who have lived long enough. He grew thin and weak. His mind remained sharp, but his body betrayed him. By August, he could no longer climb the stairs to his bedroom and had to sleep on a cot in the church vestry. Thomas visited him often. They had never been close friends, but they had worked together for 24 years, and there was a bond in that kind of shared time. "I'm dying," Father Benedict said one afternoon, stating it as a simple fact without fear or melodrama. "I know," Thomas said. "I wonder if I've done any good in this world." You've done plenty of good, Thomas assured him. Have I, though? Father Benedict looked at him with faded eyes. I couldn't save the bells when you needed me to. I couldn't find the money or the way forward. I failed you. No, Thomas said firmly. You didn't fail me. If anything, you saved me. How? By letting the bells break, Thomas said. By not trying to force a solution when there wasn't one. By accepting that some things can't be fixed, even when we desperately want them to be. That's what I needed to learn, and you taught me that. Father Benedict smiled weakly. That's very kind of you to say, but I suspect you're giving me credit for wisdom I didn't actually possess. I think I just gave up. Maybe giving up is its own kind of wisdom, Thomas said. Maybe knowing when to stop fighting is the hardest lesson of all. Father Benedict died 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in late August. The bells rang for him. 53 strokes, one for each year of his life, the traditional way of announcing a death in still water. David Thorne rang them slowly, solemnly, and the sound carried across the valley, where people heard it, and knew that someone had died, and counted the strokes to know who it was. Thomas stood in the churchyard and listened to the bells ring for Father Benedict, and he thought about all the other deaths he had rung bells for over the years. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every death announced the same way. Slow strokes, one for each year of life, the sound rolling out across the valley like a farewell. He had always thought it was a beautiful tradition, but now, listening to David ring for Father Benedict, he wondered if it was also a burden. Every death announced publicly, every grief made into a performance, every loss turned into a spectacle of sound. Maybe, he thought, there is something to be said for private grief, for deaths that happened quietly, mourned by those who loved the person, but not broadcast across the valley for strangers to count and measure. The diocese sent a new priest to replace Father Benedict. His name was Father William, and he was young, barely 30 years old, with enthusiastic ideas about liturgy and community and the role of the church in village life. One of his first acts was to propose reinstating the full schedule of bell ringing that had existed before 1723. 7 times a day, he announced at a village meeting. Dawn, mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon, evening, dusk, and night. That's the traditional pattern, and I believe we should return to it. The bells are meant to sanctify time, to remind us throughout the day that we live in God's presence. The proposal was met with mixed reactions. Some of the older villagers nodded approvingly. Some of the younger ones looked skeptical. David Thorne, sitting in the back of the meeting, said nothing. When Thomas was asked for his opinion, he stood up and said, I think 7 times a day is too much. Father William looked surprised. But that's how it's always been done. That's the tradition. Tradition isn't always right, Thomas said. And just because something was done one way in the past doesn't mean it's the best way to do it now. What would you suggest instead? 2 a day, Thomas said. Dawn and dusk. That's enough to mark the passage of time without making the bells intrusive. Let them be a gentle presence in the village, not a demanding one. But the bells are meant to call people to prayer throughout the day, Father William protested. How can we do that if we only ring them twice? People can pray without bells, Thomas said. They did it for thousands of years before bells were invented. The bells are beautiful, and I'm glad we have them, but they're not necessary for faith or prayer or any of the things that actually matter. The debate went on for an hour. In the end, the village council voted to compromise. The bells would ring 3 times a day, dawn, noon, and dusk, enough to provide structure and rhythm, but not so much as to be overwhelming. David Thorne accepted the decision without complaint. He adjusted his schedule accordingly and rang the bells 3 times daily, every day, without fail or variation. He was, Thomas thought, a better sexton than Thomas himself had ever been. David had no ego invested in the bells, no need for them to reflect his identity or give meaning to his life. He simply rang them because ringing them was the work he had chosen, and he did the work well. Years passed. The silence that had come to Stillwater after the great bell cracked never entirely disappeared, even with David Thorne ringing 3 times daily. The village had learned to live in the quiet spaces between the bells, and those quiet spaces had become as important as the bells themselves. Thomas Garrett grew older. His hair went grey, then white. His children married and moved away to larger towns where there was more work and more opportunity. Catherine's health began to fail, and Thomas spent his days caring for her, reading to her, sitting beside her as she slept. He still visited the bell chamber occasionally, but less frequently than before. David Thorne had become the undisputed master of the bells, and Thomas had finally accepted that they were no longer his in any meaningful sense. He could visit them, admire them, even ring them once in a while when David offered, but they belonged to someone else now, and that was as it should be. On a cold morning in January of 1738, 15 years after the great bell first cracked, Catherine died. She died quietly in her sleep, with Thomas sitting beside her holding her hand. Thomas sat with her body for a long time after she died. He didn't cry. He didn't call for anyone. He just sat and held her hand and thought about the 53 years they had spent together, about the life they had built in the shadow of a bell tower, about all the moments they had shared, some marked by bells, some not. Eventually he stood up and walked to the church. He found David Thorne in the bell chamber, preparing for the noon ringing. "Catherine died this morning," Thomas said. David turned, his face immediately sorrowful. "Oh, Thomas, I'm so sorry." "Thank you," Thomas said. "I came to ask. I know it's traditional to ring the bells for deaths. 58 strokes, 1 for each year of her life. But I don't want that." "You don't want me to ring for her?" "No," Thomas said. "I want her death to be quiet, private, just mine and hers, not announced across the valley for everyone to count and measure. Is that wrong?" David shook his head. "It's not wrong. It's your choice. But may I make a suggestion?" "What?" "Let me ring for her once," David said. "Just once, not 58 strokes, just one single stroke on the great bell. So beautiful and so simple that anyone who hears it will know someone beloved has died, but they won't know who or how or anything else. Just that someone loved is gone." Thomas thought about that. "All right," he said. "Just once." That afternoon, at the hour when the sun was highest in the sky, David Thorne rang the great bell one time. The sound rolled across the valley, deep and profound and impossibly beautiful. It was a sound that contained everything and nothing, a sound that marked an ending without reducing it to numbers or measurements. Thomas stood in his house and heard the bell ring for Catherine, and he wept. That single stroke became a new tradition in Stillwater. After that day, whenever someone died, David Thorne would ring the great bell once, just once, to mark the passing. Some people complained that the old way was better, that they liked knowing who had died and how old they were. But most people found the new way more moving, more respectful. The single stroke said, "Someone has died. Someone was loved. Someone will be missed." And that was all that needed to be said. Thomas Garrett lived for 7 more years after Catherine's death. He grew frail and thin, and his mind began to wander in his last years. Sometimes he forgot where he was. Sometimes he thought he was still the sexton, and he would try to climb the tower stairs to ring the bells before remembering that David Thorne had that job now. But he never forgot the river. In his last year, when he could barely walk, he would still make his way down to the riverbank in the hour before dawn and sit there listening to the water move in the darkness. It was the sound that had saved his life. All those years ago in the bell tower, when he had stood with a rope around his neck, it was the sound that had taught him that silence could be full rather than empty, that there were voices in the world worth hearing besides the ones we made ourselves. Thomas Garrett died in his sleep on a spring morning in 1745, at the age of 64. David Thorne rang the great bell once for him, and the sound carried across the valley where people heard it and thought about the old sexton who had loved the bells so much that he had nearly destroyed himself trying to save them, and who had then saved himself by learning to love the silence instead. After Thomas died, David Thorne found a letter in the bell chamber. It was written in Thomas's handwriting, sealed with wax and addressed simply, "To whoever rings these bells." David opened it and read, "To whoever rings these bells." I was the sexton of this church for 24 years. I rang these bells 7 times a day for all those years. I thought they were the most important thing in the world. I thought they were what gave meaning to time, what made moments matter, what held the village together. I was wrong. The bells are beautiful, and I'm glad we have them. But they're not necessary. They're not what makes time real or moments matter. They're just bronze hanging in a tower, and their voice is just one voice among many. If you're reading this, then you've taken up the work I once did. You've chosen to spend your days pulling ropes and making bells ring. I won't tell you that's wrong. It's not wrong. It's a good way to spend a life, if it's what you choose. But I will tell you this. Don't let the bells become everything. Don't let them drown out all the other voices in the world. Don't love them so much that you can't hear the river running, or the wind blowing, or the people you love breathing beside you at night. The bells are beautiful, but silence is beautiful too. And sometimes the most important sounds are the ones that come in the quiet spaces between the ringing. Be well, take care of the bells, but take care of yourself too. Thomas Garrett. David Thorne read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his satchel. He thought about Thomas Garrett, about a man who had loved bells so much it nearly killed him, and who had saved himself by learning to hear other things. That night, David did something he had never done before. After ringing the evening bells, he didn't immediately return to his room in the church. Instead, he walked down to the river in the gathering darkness. He sat on the bank where Thomas Garrett had sat so many mornings, and he listened to the water moving over stone. He listened for a long time, and in the listening, he heard something he had never quite heard before. Not just the sound of the river, but the sound of silence itself, which wasn't silence at all, but a kind of fullness, a presence, rather than an absence. David Thorne rang the bells in Stillwater for 43 years. He rang them through seasons and years, through wars and peace, through births and deaths, and all the ordinary moments in between. He was a good sexton, patient, skilled, dedicated. The bells were always perfectly maintained, always rang true and clear. But after reading Thomas Garrett's letter, he made one change to his practice. Every morning, before climbing the tower to ring the dawn bells, he would spend half an hour sitting by the river, listening to the water, listening to the silence, listening to all the voices in the world that weren't bells. And on the mornings when the bells rang across the valley, the people of Stillwater would hear them and think about time and beauty and the strange way that things break and mend and break again. They would think about Thomas Garrett, who had loved bells until love nearly destroyed him, and who had saved himself by learning that love could take other forms. The bells rang. The silence answered. The river ran on, as it had for thousands of years before the first bell was ever cast, as it would for thousands of years after the last bell cracked and fell silent. And in Stillwater, in the valley where dawn came late and dusk came early, the people learned to live in the spaces between sound and silence, finding meaning not in the marking of time, but in the living of it, moment by moment, breath by breath, stroke by stroke, until the day came when the great bell would ring once for them, and they too would become part of the silence that held everything.